Now, if you are here for a training on Scrie and Drie, you're in the right place. You're in the right place. So we're from Volunteers of Legal Service, as we just explained, and I'll tell you a little bit more about
If
our
you are here,
organization. So our organization was formed about 40 years ago to really what we say close the justice gap, the access to justice gap, which really means we work with community-based organizations and also law firms and different corporations who have their own attorneys to basically bring people together. So we try to connect attorneys that work in these law firms and corporations with people who are, members of the community and affiliated with different community-based organizations so that we can connect legal services to people who need them. And we do that by working with our volunteer attorneys from firms and corporations. So we have several different projects, and they're listed here. We have a senior law project, which helps older adults with life planning documents, which means wills, power of attorney, healthcare proxy, living will. So if you're ever working with anybody who's an older adult or a family member of an older adult and they're looking for free help in those documents, that's our project that does that. We have an immigration project that works with youth with various immigration issues, and specifically ages, I think about 23 and under. So again, if you ever encounter somebody 23 and under with immigration questions, you could forward them to our immigration project. We have a micro enterprise project, which helps small business owners or people who are trying to develop their own business, small business, everything from a food cart to like a yoga studio or some other type of business. There's a lot of paperwork involved and you have to go through all that and it can be really complicated if you're not sure. And so that project helps with that. We have an incarcerated mother's law project that works with women who are incarcerated in prisons and jails in New York State if they have family law issues. So that's something specific. So you may notice I did not mention the Benefits Law Project here. Well, that is the project that Maria and I are from, and that's why we're here today to talk with you all. The Benefits Law Project, as I will describe now, we help people with several different things, but our main thing that we want to talk about with you all today is Scrie and Dree. And I'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about it in depth. But quickly, if anyone is also ever needing help with unemployment insurance, we assist with that as well. So if anybody's, you hear of anybody who's lost their job and they're not sure if they're eligible for unemployment, that's exactly the types of questions we handle. So, and if anybody was denied unemployment, we can help with that. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to help people understand what benefits they're eligible for, and how to apply. And to do this, we're working with our volunteer attorneys from firms or corporations to bring them together with community-based organizations, and that's including Housing Court Answers. That's how we connected with you all today, was through HCA. And now I'll leave Maria to Maria.
here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with an overview of the Scree injury programs, what they are specifically, and why we call them rent freeze programs. Then we're going to talk about eligibility for those programs. We will talk about how to apply for Scree injury, including providing some examples of what the applications look like. And then we'll go through a Know Your Rights section where we will talk about some of the common issues that folks um, encounter when they are accessing or trying to access Scree injury.
So let's kind of start to get down into the weeds here. So what are we talking about when we're talking about Scree injury? It's kind of a funny words. And I just realized we don't really have the full name written out here. I'm just noticing. Um, SCREE stands for the Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption. Sounds complicated, sounds strange. Let me break it down. So That Scrie was created in 1970, so quite some time ago. And the idea is that it will freeze the rent of older adults, people who are 62 years old or older, from the time they first apply for Scrie. So you might say, well, that sounds great, but how does it work? Okay, so when someone is getting Scrie, it doesn't mean that the rent itself can't go up anymore. The rent legally can continue to go up. The landlord can do what it needs to do to raise the rent, whatever, following the rules they have to follow. But instead of the tenant having to pay the rent increase, the city is going to kick in the rent increase. And how do they do that? Well, instead of mailing a check in the mail or, running down to the landlord's office and giving them some money, what they do is they just give the landlord a tax credit on their tax bill. And so how that works is then there's some sort of like portion that the landlord is getting of a person's rent from their tax credit, offsetting the rent. And the tenant, as far as they're concerned, just pays the same out-of-pocket amount year to year, and the city covers the increase. So, in other words, that's why we say that the tenant is paying a frozen portion, and then the city is paying something that is called a TAC, which stands for the tax abatement credit, the credit portion. So, in some ways, what we're thinking is the total rent would be the frozen rent plus the TAC. And that can get a little confusing for people, really more or less when a tenant is applying for Scree, they want to pay attention to what the city will tell them. Okay, this is going to be your frozen rent, your rent share moving forward, and we cover the rest. So the Scree program in New York City is run by two different agencies. One agency is called the New York City Department of Finance, and one city agency is the New York City Housing Preservation and Development. There's a reason for why there's two, and we'll talk about it a little bit more um, in a minute. And just a quick note, so people who want Scree and who want to stay on Scree, they have to renew every year or 2 years, depending on the type of lease they have or the type of apartment they're living in. So it's really on the shoulders of the person who has Scree to then remember to reapply. The city is supposed to send reminders, in theory, to people, letting them know that their Scree is going to expire soon and that they should renew. But people with it really shouldn't take that for granted. And they should try to keep in mind that it's happening, keep a calendar notice about it. Um, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so the Drie program stands for the Disability Rent Increase Exemption Program. So we have the Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption Program, and then we have the Disability Rent Increase Exemption. And so Drie is an offshoot of Scree, and it was expanded, it was created basically in 2005. So it's much more recent. Um, and this is really just creating a program now in the same way. It operates the exact same way. It freezes the rent for people who are disabled. So instead of having an age requirement, a tenant must meet the program definition of disabled. So we're gonna drill down onto several details that we've just laid out here.
First, we wanted to talk a little bit about why this program is so important. Many senior citizens and people with disabilities live on a fixed income, but as we all know, the rent in New York City is ever increasing. So Scree and Dree allows seniors and people with disabilities to continue to pay the same rent over time so that they can stay in their home and helps to prevent displacement of seniors and people with disabilities. An interesting aspect of the program is that the longer someone remains in the program, the greater their benefit is. As long as the tenant renews the benefit as required and continues to meet all of the eligibility requirements, the amount that somebody pays for rent today could be the same that she's paying 20 years from now.
Okay, so we'll speak a little bit more about these eligibility requirements. So the first thing you want to think about for someone if they're eligible for Scree, the person must be 62 or older. They must currently live in, and also be the tenant, like the recognized legal tenant for an apartment. And the apartment has to be a certain type of apartment. So if you're talking with someone who says, "Well, my mom is on the lease and is named on the lease," technically speaking, then mom is the person who would need to be applying for Scree. So that can get a little confusing. Or, we're going to mention this a little bit in the future, but like, let's say mom had been on the lease and mom passes away, and now daughter says, "Well, I want to be able to get Scree." If the landlord recognizes the daughter as the new tenant, great. She's now the tenant and at least fits this eligibility requirement. And then as long as they also live in a certain type of apartment, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so the third eligibility requirement, the household income must be 50,000 or less for the prior, or just, for $49,999, basically, for the year prior to when a person is applying. So if I'd apply today in March 2026, we'd be looking at my income from last year, 2025. And that's just a quirk of the program, how they do it. And then the final eligibility requirement, and this can be a little hard for people. Um, we have another slide where we'll talk more about it. The person must also spend more than 1/3 of their monthly household income on rent. So that basically means rent is expensive for someone. It's more than 1/3 of their monthly income. And why does the city have this requirement? Because the idea is they want this program to be really for people, in their opinion, the way they define it, who really need it. And they say the kind of the way a lot of the government benefits work is generally if you're paying more than 1/3 of your income on rent, you're really hard. It's really hard. It's a really big struggle. So that's why they say we will only apply this program to people who spend more than 1/3 of their monthly household income on their rent.
Eligibility for Drie is really similar. The difference here is that instead of having an age requirement, the program is for people who have a disability, and how they define that is based on somebody receiving government benefits that are specifically for people with disabilities. So that could be something like SSI or SSDI. The other eligibility requirements are more or less the same. The person must be the tenant of record. They must live in an eligible apartment, which, as June mentioned, we'll talk about in a few minutes because that can get complicated. And the same income requirements, the household income has to be less than $50,000 a year, and the person must spend more than 1/3 of their monthly income on rent.
Okay. So, so how this program works is the city really wants people to get Scree and Dree when they live in a type of apartment where, frankly, I'll just kind of say it's not really written here, but there's some sort of laws that regulate the apartment. Like the apartment has to be follow certain rules. And so, certain types of apartments, because of these rules, the property owner, the landlord, is only legally allowed to raise the rent by a certain percentage. Legally, they can't charge whatever they want. They have to charge, under certain types of apartments, a specific percentage. So because there's a regulation around how much rent can be charged, the city says this is an eligible apartment for Scree. So that's sort of some of the reason behind this. A person has to live in like basically a regulated apartment, and you might say to yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, how do I know? What's an eligible apartment? What's a regulated apartment? Well, we give you some examples here. So a rent controlled, a rent stabilized apartment, an apartment called Mitchell Lama, um, HDFC co-op, something called the Section 236 subsidized apartment. So there's sometimes it's easier to think about what types of housing do not count. So you can almost rule them out. Like if you live in, or someone you're talking to lives in one of these other types of apartments and it's on this list of being not eligible, you can just say, uh-oh, yeah, no, Scrie doesn't apply to those programs. So people who live in what's called like a market rate apartment. So generally speaking, in New York today, these are the apartments that have the highest rents, $6,000, $10,000, in different parts of the city, or they're just, really high rents. They're not under any obligations. And sort of similarly, this could also include apartments that are in a single family home. So let's say someone lives in a basement or a first floor unit of a house in Queens, and maybe the owner of the house also lives in the house on the top floor. Well, that type of apartment won't be eligible. Or if somebody lives in a brownstone, like a three-family brownstone in a part of Brooklyn, generally speaking, that type of a building is it's considered kind of like a smaller, air quote, smaller building. It's more like almost had originally been a single family home that had been divided up, and they don't count as part of one of these regulated apartments. If someone lives in NYCHA, someone has a NYCHA apartment, unfortunately cannot get Scree, and that's because the city says that their rent is already adjusted based on their income. So they don't necessarily need this other subsidy because they're already subsidized and their rent should always be a third of their income. It'll never be more than a third of their income. So that automatically means you can't get Scree. If you have a project-based Section 8 apartment, some people you're talking to may not know for sure if they have a Section 8 apartment. It would really be, they would want to take a look at some of their documents that they sign with the management office every year. There's really clues on those documents if it says in small print somewhere about Section 8 somewhere. They may also they live in a private co-op. There's lots of private co-ops and condos. It's actually not included here, but a condo, private co-op or condo. And if somebody has a Section 8 voucher, they're also not able to get Scree or Dree because similarly, the government's position, the city's position is they already have help paying their rent, and their rent should always be adjusted to being exactly a third of their income, which means it'll never be more than a third of their income and they won't ever get Scree, and they're already getting a subsidy. So that's kind of tricky. So you want to look at this top list of the types of apartments that are eligible to think if someone is in one of those.
So to talk a little bit more about those eligible types of apartments, if someone's in a rent-controlled apartment, that would typically be in an older building with six or more units. Rent-controlled apartments are very rare in New York City today. Typically, it's folks who have either been there a really long time themselves or who inherited the apartment from an older family member. More common are rent-stabilized apartments. These are also typically in older buildings with six or more units, although some newer buildings may also be rent stabilized. There's always a lease, or there should be a lease with a rent stabilized apartment. And in theory, that lease should say that it is a rent stabilized lease. And that will be renewed every 1 or 2 years. And then the rent increases by a certain percentage each year. And then other types of eligible buildings, as Jean mentioned, are Mitchell-Lama, HDFC co-ops, or Section 236. And someone, you might be talking to, or you may not know what type of apartment they have exactly. It can be complicated. And so it's always helpful to review the lease if there is one, or other tenancy papers or other paperwork. Um, consider someone, consider whether someone may already have a rent that adjusts based on their income.
Okay. So now we're just going to move on to the next eligibility requirement, which is the total household income requirement. So the idea is the rule is your total income for all the household members living in the apartment for the tax year preceding the application must be no more than 50,000 per year. So this is a pretty big bucket. When the city is reviewing Scrie applications, they're actually going to consider pretty much everything that you have as income. So if you work, if anybody in your family is working, if there's Social Security income, a pension income, sometimes people have a savings account and they earn interest on it. That interest counts as income. I mean, it's kind of a lot of things. Um, there's some things that are not included as income, and this is a more clear list, like a cash gift. If somebody just got a bunch of cash as a gift, I guess, $5,000, here we go. They're not going to count that. If someone gets an inheritance, all of a sudden, that won't count. Nazi victim reparations, energy assistance payments. So if somebody has HEAP, that type of a program, some of you may have heard of, it's a program through HRA to help with utility benefits, or I'm sorry, help with utility bills. um, Certain types of, I guess tax refunds, IRA, and annuity distributions. Again, depending on who you're talking to, these things may or may not apply, but we've seen all kinds of things here, so we include everything. SNAP benefits, food stamps, that doesn't count. Personal injury awards. So if you talk to somebody and they just won a big lawsuit and they just got a bunch of money from that lawsuit, they fell on the sidewalk, they sue the city and they got a bunch of money for it, that money doesn't count. So something important to note is we keep mentioning the household income. So you really want to look at anybody who's living in the apartment, what their income is when you do the math to add up to 50,000. But there is an exception to this. If you're talking to someone and they have a roommate, or maybe someone that's just kind of like renting a room in their apartment. A lot of people need help paying rent these days. So if they have a spare room, they rent it out. So they're not actually kind of considered part of your household. They're sort of a roommate. They have their own separate household. And sort of a way to think about this is, do you share meals together? Or do you have a separate shelf in the fridge? Like, do you have a divide up who does what in the home, and you kind of have your own two separate worlds, including financially, really. Um, it's a little trickier if you're thinking if somebody's a family member. We hear from people who are like, well, my son is in his own separate world. Well, it's a little different. It can get a little complicated. The city usually sort of assumes family members technically count as household members, so it can get a little tricky. But generally speaking, I'm just going to talk here about roommates, somebody who's just renting a room. They're not a household member, so you don't need to count their income as this analysis. But if they pay rent to the person from whom they're renting this room, that's what you count. So this is very confusing. Let's give an example. So Mary rents a room to Jim. Jim pays Mary 1,000 per month for the room. Mary's income, oops, I gotta move my window here, between her pension and Social Security is 30,000 annually. Okay, so if it was just her alone, she's well under 50,000. But we got to think about Jim. Jim is employed. His annual salary is 52,000. Uh-oh, if we total them together, that's going to be way more than 50,000. But fortunately, Mary does not need to include his salary as part of her household income for Scrie and Drie purposes. She just has to add in how much he pays over the year. So he pays $1,000 a month. So that's $12,000 a year. So 12,000 plus her 30,000 from pension and Social Security totals 42. So she's still well below the 50,000. So that's how you would do that math if you were thinking that through.
Additionally, the applicant must spend more than 1/3 of her monthly income on rent. So to do some easy math, give an easy example. If somebody's monthly income is $3,000 per month, 1/3 of that is $1,000. So to be eligible, the rent must be over $1,000 per month.
Yes, I always say this is the moment. Well, if you didn't need the calculator yet, you might need it here. Okay. So now that we've talked about eligibility, we wanted to show you all what these applications look like and what you need to do to help somebody fill it out or for you to fill it out. And I will now sort of tell you a little bit more about why we have two different agencies that work with Scrie and Drie, and it's partially because it depends on the type of apartment. So HPD administers Scrie and Drie for Mitchell-Lama apartments, other redevelopment companies, the ones that we listed before, the Section 236, HDFCs, that's what like a redevelopment company is. So why there are reasons for this, but I don't think we all need to know. But just know that these types of apartments, HPD is the agency. And, you can sort of do a bit of sleuthing online to find these documents. They occasionally shift around their websites. So, it may be you're searching, you're clicking these links, or you look at these links, they would work, but you might have to, honestly, sometimes they do change their websites here and there. So you might have to double check this when you're helping someone or you're applying. Um, you can download an application and complete it. You can, fill it out, however you want, but essentially, when you complete your application, for HPD, you can email the scan, like, so you fill it out as long as it's like a PDF document put together, all the pages, you can email it to this email address, scrie@hpd.nyc.gov, or you can put it in the mail to HPD here at their Scrie unit. Department of Finance is a little different. Department of Finance is the agency that oversees everybody else. So rent stabilized apartments, rent controlled apartments, and that's frankly really the biggest bucket of Scrie and Drie for the most part. And you can also find those documents online. They have frankly, in my opinion, a better website to access them. If you Google search, you search rent freeze NYC. This is usually the first thing that comes up. Department of Finance strongly encourages people to apply online and set up an account through the tenant access portal. And it's actually linked to kind of a same portal that New York City uses for a lot of different types of programs. Um, but a lot of people have trouble accessing the internet or using a computer, especially a lot of times people applying for Scrie and Drie if they're an older adult or someone with a disability. So a person can apply with a paper application. Going to these links here, you could click and download an application, print it out, can fill it out, and you can complete it and mail it to the Department of Finance here. Maria and I were just talking about the other day, the Department of Finance used to allow people to email documents, applications. They do not do that anymore. And if you try to email your Scrie or Drie application to Department of Finance, they will not get it. And it's gonna get lost. That's what we've determined. So it sort of depends. If you're feeling confused, the applications themselves do have directions on them of what to do with them, where to send them. So it is they do try to lay it out for you a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, yes, I was told emailing the Department of Finance, the application is highly discouraged. Um, let's see. Yes. So this is the Department of Finance Scrie application. And of note, this can be either the initial application or the renewal application. It's the same exact form. If the person already has Scrie, they should include their current docket number associated with their current Scrie case in order to do the renewal. And then it just asks some basic information like the name, social security number, address, and then it'll want information for the different household members. And just a flag, going back to what Jean said earlier. Subletters or roommates are not considered household members for Scrie purposes, but any rent that those people pay should be included in income.
Okay, so this is the second page. And if you all were thinking about what I said a few slides ago, that the tenant, it's their responsibility to renew every year. Well, it can get a little hard to remember, especially for some older adults or for some people with disabilities. So when a person applies or renews their screen injury, they have an option to say they want someone to be a representative, and that person will get like extra copies sent to them about their Scrie application or whatever, an approval or any type of follow-up notice. So it's optional but recommended. Generally speaking, a person should be, we recommend a family member or a very good friend, someone who will remain in the person's life for some time. You could list a lawyer or a social worker or some other, I don't know, person that you interact with, but sometimes, like especially sometimes us, at least attorneys, we may not be working with someone forever. And we may leave our jobs, we may not be in the same office or wherever, so you want, and it's mailed to the office, so you really want to make sure it gets to someone who will kind of be connected with that tenant for the long haul, and it is personal. It's sort of a personal thing. So it is helpful to think that this person will be getting notified also that I need to renew my scree. If a person changes their mind and they no longer want someone to be their tenant representative, or the tenant representative wants to opt out for whatever reason, they can fill out an opt-out form. And that's, there's a way you can find that document here. And then finally, at the bottom of page 2 is where a person essentially is signing the application, and they're in the process of signing the application. They're explaining that everything, all the information they provided is true. They're letting the city know, like, yes, to the best of my knowledge, these are everyone in my household. This is my income. Everything I'm providing is true. So this is at the point where we usually explain to people, you have to be honest as you possibly can, as far as to explain all your income and the income of everybody else. Sometimes if someone is not 100% sure if they're eligible, well, as long as you're honest about everything when you apply, you represent, you say how much you make and how much your family members make, and you submit the documents. That's what the city will do, is they're going to figure it out. Like, they're going to evaluate. So that is probably honestly one of the most important things, is when you sign on here, you're saying, yes, everything I'm saying is true. All the details I provided are true as far as I know. So the city will basically say, okay, now we'll make a decision. Oh, here you go, Maria.
Yes, and then this is the third page, which includes instructions about what documents to attach. In general, someone who is applying who has a rent stabilized apartment, for example, should provide a copy of the current lease and the prior lease. And then folks usually need to attach proof of income for new applications and renewals.
Yeah, and I think this list is very helpful if you're an advocate also, and you're trying to think about what you're telling someone they need to attach copies of in their application. It kind of goes down this list for you, so it's pretty helpful. Okay. Okay, so one quick thing. The Department of Finance has this interesting form where if someone has received Scree for 5 or more years, they have the option of using this short form renewal. And that really just means they don't have to fill in and submit quite the same amount of documents or information. And it's pretty straightforward. The tenant is filling in their information, who who's in their household. And it really is, they're asking, has your household income changed? since the last time you renewed. And you're saying, if you say yes, you have to provide proof. If you say no, you don't have to submit anything else. But you do need to send in, as you can see in this other picture, your renewal lease. And if you did answer that there is any additional income, you have to submit that proof. And then you have to, depending on applicable, proof of income for the last year for any new household members. So if there's anybody new, you have to add their information. So it's really they're assuming for people who've had this more than 5 years, their income's not changing. But just in case, if it has, you have to submit that new evidence. And you can also list your tenant representative again.
H HPD is an entirely different form, so definitely important to make sure that if someone's applying, they're using the correct form for the type of housing that they live in. So for HPD, there's no need to provide a lease. The person just needs to list the name of the complex or the housing development where they live. That's because HPD oversees so much Alama buildings or basically already has that information. And then they have to attach supporting documents, which again is listed on the instructions, but it's proof of age, which is generally a photo ID, the prior year's tax return, other proof of income, and sometimes bank statements, depending on the type of income. Um, and then there's no exact renewal application. HPD should be sending out a recertification form every 2 years when it's time for that person or and more specifically that the whole development to recertify. And then if the tenant doesn't complete that, they'll be removed. They don't always get the recertification forms, but they should be getting a recertification form in the mail when it's time to recertify.
Okay, so we just wanted to also then show you the Drie initial and renewal application. So there is a separate application and renewal form for Drie, but it looks very similar. It's very similar to what we just discussed with Scrie. And so this is again, now we're going back to the Department of Finance. So you know, you're asking for your basic information, the tenant's name, social security number, address. You list out the household members, making a note that roommates are not household members, but you'll be adding them into your math of your income. Okay.
Yes, and then very similar again, but then the list of required documents, Drie will require the person attach proof of disability, which could be like an SSDI or SSI award letter, proof that someone's receiving those documents or receiving those benefits.
And I guess I think I just want to jump in quickly to say I just realized if anybody's out there wondering proof of disability, what does that mean? We talk to a lot of people that will say, well, I'm disabled. I'm disabled. Look, I'm using a walker or I have a different medical condition and I believe that I am disabled. And so we as advocates, I believe that person. I'm like, yes, I believe you and I believe that that is your experience and how you're feeling about your ability to navigate space in the world. But the city sees it differently. The city will only recognize that someone has a disability basically if the federal government has already given someone a, another type of benefit, recognizing them as disabled. So it's a very high standard, actually. It's hard to do, in my opinion. Someone has to apply usually for Social Security disability, which can take a year or two to get. You have to, or SSI similarly can take some time. So you need to have like basically a government recognized disability. So sometimes people come to us and they want to apply for Dre, and I say, well, until what you're describing is your condition is recognized and you begin to receive a benefit, you can't yet apply for jury, which is sort of frustrating. But honestly, sometimes depending on if you're an advocate or you're the tenant, this might be the first time you're hearing this, so it is helpful to know, okay, now I know I should start that process so I can then try to apply for Drie. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a little note.
And should we, just before we move on from Dree, we should probably just flag that to make things even more
Oh,
confusing
yes.
as to
I know.
where to apply,
Yes.
all Dree applications go to the Department of Finance.
Yeah.
With Scrie, it depends on the type of building, but with Dree, all applications are with the Department of Finance. And that page we were just on listed the type of building and then the type of evidence or proof they want to see, depending on the type of building you're in.
Yes. Just to make it more confusing. I guess in a way it's easier. If someone's applying for Drie, they just go to Department of Finance. I don't know. We don't know why the city divided it up this way, but they did. Who knows? There is an answer, but for our purposes, we don't really need to know. Okay. So for our last sort of segment, we wanted to spend some time talking about some questions that come up a lot for people we meet with and talk with, which are very, very, very reasonable questions and very much the reality of what people encounter when they're thinking about these benefits, especially if they're thinking about their landlord or what they're gonna, how it's gonna work. So, do I need my landlord's permission to apply, or can my landlord refuse to participate? No, legally, a landlord cannot stop someone from applying. And if a tenant is eligible, she's legally re she's legally able to get the benefit, and the landlord must accept that there's now going to be a tenant share and a Scrie share. And I will say, a person doesn't even need to tell the landlord they're applying. A person can just do it on their own, working with an advocate, get approved, and then surprise, the landlord will get a letter saying this person got Scrie, they're going to get a tax credit, and you can only charge them their frozen rent share. So we've had clients worried about that, but they can just apply on their own. They don't need permission to do it. They can just go for it. Um, but that said, there's a question, does Scrie or Drie protect me from eviction? We've heard this question a lot. Well, if I have Scrie, I can't be evicted, right? And so Scrie does not prevent eviction. It is not a barrier to a landlord bringing someone to court for a housing court case, an eviction case. The landlord can bring it on whatever reason they normally would bring it under, whether that's saying the tenant didn't pay rent or some problem in the apartment, whatever. But a big important thing is that the landlord can't sue a tenant for the city portion. So if you remember, we talked about how there's the city portion and then the frozen tenant portion. So as long as the tenant has their Scrie, basically active, or their Drie active, the landlord can only sue if the tenant stopped paying their frozen share. They can't have a problem with what the city's doing with their share. They can't sue the tenant for that. That's not the tenant's responsibility. What if I have a preferential rent in my rent stabilized apartment? Yes, the tenant can still get Scrie and Drie, and the rent will actually be frozen at your preferential rent level. What if I do not renew my Scrie or Drie on time? Okay, this can get a little complicated. Well, then at some point, if a person is very delayed in their renewal, the city will stop paying the the credit because they didn't get the renewal form. So that means they'll stop giving the tax credit to the landlord. Um, so, however, for Department of Finance Scree, there is a grace period where the landlord must continue to recognize the benefit for 6 months after it expires, even if it hasn't been renewed yet. In HPD, the tenant will actually be removed from the program in the January of the following year if they fail to complete the recertification form. So there's generally speaking a bit of a grace period, a bit of time frame. The idea is someone really needs to not wait when they know their Scree is about to be up to think about their renewal. And this comes up, these questions come up for me and Maria a lot. But generally speaking, people want to kind of keep up on the process. Um, some people ask us, well, what happens if I live in, like, let's say, a rent stabilized apartment where I need to provide my lease when I apply and renew my scree? What if the landlord hasn't given me a lease yet, or they're delayed, or something's wrong with it? Well, that kind of goes to another law, like a totally different law. Legally, a landlord must provide a renewal lease for rent stabilized units. So if they're not doing that, that's kind of like another legal issue, which of course impacts your scree, but it's a big issue. It can happen. So a tenant can fill out a certification form saying that I didn't get my lease. And that's basically they're just telling Department of Finance, I want to renew, but I didn't get my lease. And they're filling out this form just saying that. What if I'm denied Scrie or Drie? So someone applies and they don't get it, or they get denied for whatever reason. Maybe the city says your income is $52,000, your household income. Maybe the city says you don't live in the right type of apartment, whatever. Well, the tenant does have the right to appeal within the city agency. And if they're denied again, they can then file another type of appeal in a different type of court. So there is a bit of a legal process if someone is denied. So we talked about this earlier. What if someone is not the legal tenant for the apartment, the person you're talking to, or the person who has the question? Well, only the legal tenant, usually the person named on the lease or like the head of household, is eligible to get scree injury.
So some other questions we see. What if I move? Can I transfer my scree to a new apartment? Um, yes, provided that the new apartment is an eligible type of apartment. The tenant has to complete a particular form. It's called a benefit transfer application or portability request form in order to transfer the benefit to the new apartment. Can my Scree or Dree transfer to a family member? Yes. When the named tenant passes away or permanently vacates the apartment, a family member who remains in the apartment can take over the benefit, provided that family member is eligible for Scree or Dree. For example, that person is 62 or older at the time, their income is below 50,000. And they were listed, this is key, listed as a household member on the Scree or Dree application. Um, and then they must have succession rights to the apartment. And then, provided all those requirements are met, that there's a benefit takeover application form. Can someone switch from Dree to Scree or vice versa? Yes. A tenant can submit a particular form in order to do that. Um, what if someone moves in with me or moves out or someone's income changes? Yes, if there are changes to the household size or household income, the tenant can contact whatever agency is in charge of the benefit to report that information. Will Scree cover rent increase from an MCI, MCR, capital assessment, or J51 rent increase? Yes. These generally have to be approved by DHCR for rent stabilized units or HPD for other kinds of units. And then the tenant can complete a particular form, a tax adjustment application or capital assessment application, depending on the type of housing. Basically, there are forms for people to fill out if these various scenarios come up. Um, but will Scree or Dree cover air conditioner fees? No. Um,
Get that all out.
Things like air conditioning, garages, parking, storage, and security deposits are not included.
Yeah, if you're ever looking for documents or not sure, the websites that I referenced, the Department of Finance rent freeze page, and again it's harder to find, but the HPD page for screen injury have different documents you can click on and download. That's honestly the best way to find them. But again, short of if you can't find them, contacting the agencies is really the best bet. And I think that leaves us for questions.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This has been super informative, especially for us advocates who are trying to help tenants in this crazy, confusing realm of benefits. So we have a bunch of questions. Let's see, let's scroll all the way up. Um, so one question says, how to fight Scrie fraud when a landlord refuses to accept the Scrie?
Wow, that is a great question.
Yeah.
Oh, and that is a very good question because there's kind of actually several things someone can do. And it, generally speaking, I will say, is honestly fighting in housing court. So sometimes this issue comes up if someone's been brought to court because the landlord in housing court, because the landlord will say, I'm not accepting this scree. The tenant owes this money. And so in that case, if a person is in housing court, the best thing to do, truly, this is like not a great answer, but is to try to find a lawyer because the lawyers can argue the legal arguments why the landlord must accept Scrie. If a person has not yet been in housing court but wants to also fight it, sometimes working with an attorney to send something called like a demand letter or a letter to the landlord to say, like, you have to credit this. Here's the law. This is what you have to do. But I guess the short answer is sometimes landlords will, to stop this fraud or to stop them from not accepting it, comes up a lot. And it really is usually someone needs to help make the argument to the landlord legally that they're not required. I would also say a good option is to reach out to the Human Rights Commission in New York City, which investigates discrimination. Because to some degree, there's an argument that if someone's refusing to accept Scree benefits, they are discriminating on the basis of a person's type of income. Because while Scree is not a type of income, it is a type of benefit. And mm, there's lots of legal backup to the support this argument that legally they can't say that someone was screwed. Like, I can't accept that because
Mm,
that kind of counts as like a type of discrimination under New York City law.
right.
So then making a complaint to the Human Rights Commission, which actually you can do, you can get through that process by calling 311 and saying, how can I best connect to file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission? And I know that also, I don't know the website off the top of my head, but Googling it to find the website can be helpful because then there's a description of how to file a complaint with them because they would investigate that and reach out to the landlord and say, hey, you can't do that,
Got
basically.
you. Got you. Got you. Awesome. There's another question. These are all really, really great questions. That says, like, in talking about like the income requirement, like that 50,000 and lower, the question says, like, if a tenant had to pay like a medical expense, right? Like, or pays medical expenses, does that kind of affect the amount? Like, is that something that kind of, I don't know how to ask that question.
Maybe I'm reading.
Changes the amount, I guess. Like, is the medical expenses recognized as like a reason to change the income amount, I think is like how the question is being asked.
Hmm.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. There's sort of a limited number of things that they don't include in income, which we listed on the slide we showed earlier, or things sort of adjustments they make to income. And so medical expenses, unfortunately, don't change that $50,000 um, limit,
Got you.
which is
Awesome.
a shame.
Yeah. And then a question I had. So in talking about like the first of all, it's interesting to know because we always wondered like we say like we always say like the city will cover the increase, but it's helpful to understand like how the city is covering the increase in the form of like a tax credit. So when the tenant gets that lease renewal, right, is the like frozen amount gonna show up on that lease renewal, or is it just gonna be the increased amount and then they submit that with their Scree renewal application?
This is an awesome question. So when the person is doing their lease renewal, legally, there's nothing about the rent stabilized lease renewal that it would even mention Scrie on it. It
Okay.
would actually just look totally normal as if nothing is going on.
Okay.
Um, so a person would submit that in their renewal application to Scrie. And then what happens is then the city in the background says, oh, okay, we see Ms. Jones, your rent just went up $25. We're gonna renew your scree and we're gonna now send you a letter letting you know that we've just processed your renewal. We're gonna cover that additional 25, so our tax share will go up, and you're only legally responsible for, let's say, $900, whatever the frozen rent had been. So I
Mhm.
think to your question, Ariana, you're sort of wondering, well, what's the tenant supposed to do? Like, what are they looking at? The lease to what? How do they know what to pay? The lease or the letter they just got from Department of Finance saying what should I be paying?
Right.
So we look at those two documents together. So like
Okay.
we see there's the legal renewal lease where we can see what the legal rent is, but then we also want to see that letter from the city saying, okay, we've gotten your renewal lease. We see that this is what your new legal rent is, and we're gonna now keep your rent frozen. You're only responsible for this frozen amount, but we're gonna kick up how much we pay. So
Okay.
oh, it's almost like the lease is the agreement between the tenant and the landlord, but now this piece of paper telling a tenant what their frozen rent share is like the agreement between Department of Finance and the tenant, kind of, And so that's you kind of you want to have both. And we always say that whatever the tenant is told to pay based on that letter and that box is legally, as far as the law is concerned, legally what they're responsible to pay. And occasionally Maria and I notice that Department of Finance might have done the math wrong or they made a mistake.
Mhm.
But generally speaking, that's what the tenant wants to use as proof of what they're legally allowed to pay based on what the law says, whatever they're told is their frozen rent. I don't know if
Gotcha.
that answered your question.
No, yes, definitely. And then just for clarification for us, and again, those of us that like are going to be referring folks to you guys are able to like assist people with the application process and like questions and stuff like that, right?
Yes.
Perfect.
Definitely. And I was
Wonderful.
actually going to ask, I did not include a slide. I should have. I can't believe I forgot. With our hotline number and our email so people can reach out to say like, they can leave us a voicemail, they can send us an email saying, "Hi, I'm interested in applying for Scree or Dree. I'm not sure if I'm eligible. Can you help me assess if I'm eligible and help me with an application?" And that's the exact type of thing we do. Or if someone is not sure if they want to renew, but they don't, can we help them with a renewal? We can do that too. So Maria, I think, is going to drop in the chat.
Yes, just did it.
Oh yes. Oh yes. So
Perfect.
yeah, so in there is how people can reach us. And yeah, that's exactly what we do. We help people with screen applications and renewals, things like that.
Perfect. That sounds great. And then the one right below mine, again, really great question. A tenant says, I have a neighbor who is 62 years old and visually impaired and receiving disability benefits in a rent stabilized apartment. It seems as though they're eligible for both options. Is there any reason for them to submit one application over the other?
Oh, that's another great question. They're same program, so either one is equally good. But I will say, just in experience, Scree is easier in a way because fortunately, just showing your proof of ID, a
Yeah.
person, if this person showed her ID, boom, that's all you need. So if I know this person described that they were blind, in theory, probably, I'm guessing, could have Social Security disability or could have a
Right.
benefit. But
Mhm.
sometimes, that's actually kind of can be one of the trickier types of conditions where, depending on how far someone's vision has been impaired, they may not have that yet, whatever. So
Yeah.
usually, Scree is just a little more straightforward and easier to prove, it feels, but it's totally okay, either one.
Okay, sounds good. That was a great question. Another question says, does your organization assist with appeals and advocacy? And then the same person asked, can a person have more than one authorized representative? I'm guessing for the renewal process.
Yes, we do assist with appeals. So
Mhm.
that is great. That is fun. And that's a great question about more than one tenant representative. I don't think so. I think it's only the one. And I guess my hunch is that's just administrative because probably the agencies they're like entering in a data field, like who is the person, the tenant rep, and they probably just don't have the mechanism set up to do that. And if I bet you it's if a form is generated to go out to the tenant, it's just automatically generated to the tenant representative. And I don't know if they have it set up to add another person. Unfortunately, I've never heard of that before, but I could look into whether it's possible.
Okay, awesome. And then we have a representative from Councilmember Brewer's office, which is
Yay.
wonderful. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
The question says, do you have insight on the status of Governor Hochul's recent announcement to increase the income eligibility limits for screen injury from 50 to 75,000?
Ah, I'm very excited about this. Yes, we're really hoping that this passes, this goes through, but I don't have any great updates yet. So far, we're all still kind of wondering, what's going to happen if the budgets will be approved, if this will actually be changed and raised. And I guess for those of you who haven't heard, the $50,000 rent limit is a hard eligibility requirement. It would be really amazing if that cap could go up to 75,000. I mean, or even more, but at least right now, the state is considering raising the cap to 75,000. The governor, yes, included in her budget that this idea would be raised. It hasn't yet, happened, but we are waiting. And I unfortunately I don't know the exact status. I know that there's just so many the budgetary hearings and they're still in the works. And actually, we are part of groups that are doing some advocacy to sort of encourage that this happens.
Yeah, awesome. Sarah's question. When we're talking about income, is this gross income or net, pre or post tax?
I'm looking at Maria. See what Maria.
It is gross pre-tax. Again, unfortunately.
Oof. Okay.
Okay. Another question from Sarah. Sarah, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Oh yeah, I was checking out others.
While you're
I
here.
had lots of I so appreciate being able to learn more about this. Oh shoot, where did that? Oh, right. Okay. So let's say the tenant has Scree or Dree, and then they lose income and they can't afford their rent, and then they fight real hard to get a voucher like FEPS or City FEPS to help them keep the apartment that they no longer can afford. So do they keep their Scree or Dree? Um, or do they then lose Scree or Dree? Because somebody had asked, like, because you had mentioned how folks who have a NYCHA apartment or who have Section 8, because they're already getting a subsidy that keeps their apartment affordable,
Mhm.
um, they can't get Scree or Dree to start. But what if somebody already has Scree or Dree, and then because of, life happens, they can't afford the apartment on their own, but they do get a subsidy like FEPS, City FEPS. Do they still hang on to the Scree Dree, or does it just kind of go away now that they have a subsidy that's helping to keep them in their home?
That is a great question, and it's so funny as you're describing because you're I can see why it's so feels so weird because yes, it does sometimes not make sense. It feels like a tangle, and how do you untangle it? So weirdly enough, if someone like you were describing has Scree and then let's say then gets Section 8 or something, because of the nature of those programs and how they're defined, somebody would then become ineligible for Scree. But interestingly enough, if someone then gets FEPS and City FEPS, it is possible to keep your Scree because, and again, it's sort of the nature of the programs, like different way that they work a little, but it's that my understanding, I haven't encountered this before, but I encountered it for a colleague. Their Scree portion will remain the same, and then it's sort of like their FEPS or city FEPS will be calculated by their frozen rent. So it's almost like going to be treated as like a preferential rent. So Scree, you have Scree and now lost your income, you get FEPS. So the city will kick in a FEPS subsidy to basically, in addition to whatever Scrie is paying, to cover everything up and until your share that FEPS figures out. So, long story short, it is possible to have FEPS and city FEPS if you have Scrie. You won't lose your Scrie.
That is so, so helpful to know because, you might only have FEPs for a short while your children is still
Yeah.
under 18, and then they move out or they turn 18 and all of a sudden, oh shoot, you don't want to end up in a sort of
Yeah.
rent cliff.
Right.
Which reminded me of another question that I have, and I'm jumping the line a little bit. When the tenant has a preferential rent, I did wonder, is the city paying, or is the city paying the preferential rent increases, or is the city paying the legal regulated rent, like the legal maximum for this apartment?
Oh, another really good question. So if a person has a pref rent, and this is like currently now, and there are the annual increases that go in each year on top of your pref, that's what the city's going to cover. So they won't be like covering the high up to the legal amount. They're just going to be covering the pref rent increase. Yeah.
Great. So the program that makes it a little bit more affordable for the city to actually do this program. Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a little, there's a new law that went into effect. It's section 610, and some of you may have heard this, and it is a new type of structure that landlords can apply for basically a rent increase on top of a rent stabilized rent. This is something totally separate from pref rent, but you might hear it. Landlords can apply for like a rent increase while someone is receiving a subsidy, like FEP, City FEP, Section 8. And I actually it's sort of fairly new. There's new law coming out on this now as we speak. It's very confusing to tenant advocates. I'm not sure yet how that will interplay with Scree. My hunch is basically the city will just increase its frozen TAC portion, and the tenant will just continue to pay their frozen rent, and that's all they need to worry about. And it might be that finance will now have to be paying a larger chunk, although the FEPS and City FEPS portion should be also kicking in. So I don't know how that's going to work, the three programs, or the two programs as they interplay. But that's a new type of rent scheme, like I don't mean scheme in a bad way, like they're the schematic, like how they're structuring it. And that's under, I think it's the PHL section 610. So I don't know if you're interested in that, I could tell you more about that offline, but that might be another funky thing coming in soon.
While we're talking, like we have more questions in the chat for sure, but I just want to, while we're on the topic of the FEPS, City FEPS, Scree entanglement situation, a follow-up question did appear about like when there's benefit like issues with recertifications, as there always is with these programs. The question is like, is there advice on like which one to address first? So I'm guessing in the situation where the tenant has both, right? Like let's say City Febs and Scree, and there's an issue with her certification. Is there any advice about like which problem should get addressed first? Which, yeah.
Maria, what do you think? Looking at you.
I would love your thoughts on that, Jean, because it's a really good question.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you, yeah, I feel like I might have to can you remind saying that again? I feel like this is kind of a tricky one.
It is for sure. We can ask the tenant for some clarification as well, advocate for some clarification. But the question is like in a situation where a tenant may have both programs, so like let's say City FEPS and Scree, and there's recertification issues, is there any advice about which like program should be tacked first, the Scree
Oh,
or
this is a challenging question. So I like to say there is a bit of a hierarchy in terms of benefits that you want to address. So I would definitely say FEPS first,
okay,
because it more directly affects sort of what the tenant is paying out
got
of pocket.
got it, got it.
Because FEPS and City FEPS is once somebody has it, is tagged to 30% of your income. Roughly speaking, you have a kind of like a FEPS or City FEPS share. So
Yeah.
usually that is the bigger program to address and make sure is active and staying active so that the majority of the rent can be paid. Because usually to get FEPS, city FEPS, there's something going on where the rent payments are struggle. And
Right.
so a person really needs to have a share adjusted to their income. And something different about Scree and Dree is that it's not the portion a tenant pays is not adjusted based on their income. It's just frozen at whatever they were paying when they first applied. So
Yeah.
like maybe somebody first applied when their rent was $900, and at that time that was great. They could afford that, but then they lose their income. Well, depending on type of income loss, they can't afford that 900, and that's all Scree is going to help them with. They're still stuck at the 900.
Yeah.
So FAPS is the different type of program that comes in and says, "Oh wow, okay, you lost your job. We're going to cover $600 of your rent, and you'll only cover the $300 remaining." So generally speaking, if you're thinking about triage, you would want to be addressing a FEPS benefit first, getting that straightened out, and then thinking about Scree. Now, of course, it can get a little dicey if someone's Scree is about to expire.
Right.
Like, what do I do? Well, nothing is preventing someone for also then submitting their renewal for Scree. It's just that generally speaking, and you should actually, you should, but really for someone with both, it's FEPS that's really helping someone to have an affordable apartment and when they're really facing no income at all.
Yeah. This is really, again, really, really great questions. Thank you,
Yeah, really,
everyone.
this is great. I can tell you all are doing this training out there because these are the things that come up,
Yes.
you know?
Yes. And we have another question from the representative from Councilmember Perua's office. This question says, we're seeing constituents on Scree receiving rent bills that don't reflect the benefit slash frozen amount. They get anxious seeing the higher rent amounts, even when we confirm with Department of Finance that their Scree status is active. However, Department of Finance doesn't have enforcement authority. How would you recommend resolving this?
This is a common question and so frustrating, and so hard. So I am not at all surprised to hear this. And this is, in fact, a fairly common scenario. So, like as you're describing, someone has Scree, a rent ledger, or the documentation from the landlord does not reflect the Scree. And so that is something interesting. So legally, a landlord has to maintain records of what rents tenants are paying, what's due. There's not a lot of specific rules on how a landlord does this, just that they have to do it. And to some degree, that law comes out of lots of lots of I guess, cases through housing court, where when landlords are suing tenants for rent arrears in housing court, they have to be able to justify the arrears. How can they show their math, basically?
Right.
So that's where a lot of this comes out is that landlords like have to kind of keep some kind of documentation about it. Do they do it in the way we all want them to? No. Are they doing it in a way that makes sense? Not always. In legal, like I guess the from the housing court's perspective, from housing law, it just has to be that it's cleared and they can explain it and somebody else could understand it. So if somebody were in housing court and they had an attorney, they could argue this ledger does not reflect the Scree payments and it's not an accurate representation of what's due. And if the housing court judge agreed, they'd say they got to fix it. But that said, it may not even necessarily be fixed. It's just whatever the landlord is trying to sue for in court, that number would get fixed. This is a huge problem actually in many ways, not just in the Scree context. So, what may be a best way of doing it is perhaps if a tenant is able to find an attorney who could write a demand letter or work with, I guess, someone who could write a kind of formal looking letter to send to the landlord to say, or if the landlord has an attorney, if a person doing this writing this letter, they'd have to mail it to the landlord's lawyer. That can get complicated. But if a non-attorney is writing this, they could send it to the landlord, um, and say, legally you have to reflect and credit the Drie and the Scree. Please credit it. But that said, it's really there's not a lot like forcing the hand of a lot of landlords to keep their records the way they want. They just legally, if they were bringing someone to court, would have to credit those payments. If they ever, this is another type this could come up if a landlord is you know sending rent statements or having a rent ledger that doesn't reflect Drie, and let's say they don't bring someone to housing court saying that they owe money, maybe even including the Drie share, and they bring them to small claims court, like a debt, like they're just saying, oh, the tenant owes a debt, the same arguments could be made that they're not accurately reflecting these repayments. They have to credit the payments. There's a bunch of laws and rules around they have to credit them. Not necessarily the ledger itself is defective, but that they can only sue for a debt that's actually owed. Like legally, that's a pretty clear standard in most types of cases, like when people are seeking a debt. So if they're not crediting it, then that's a defense to some of that. So this kind of issue when we're seeing tenants upset by statements or ledgers that don't accurately reflect things is kind of a bigger category called like misapplication of rent. They're just not crediting things properly. And this does come up all the time. It's a huge fight for many tenants in housing court, arguing that the breakdown of what they're being accused of owing is not actually accurate. So it unfortunately often feels like you need a lawyer involved for the tenant to help work it out, just because a lot of times a landlord's position will be, well, until I'm legally being told that I can't do this, I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, you know? So it can get really challenging. It can be a challenge.
Yeah, this is wonderful.
Um,
Oh,
could
go
we
ahead, Sarah.
just back? There were a couple income related questions that it would be great to hit. I mean, first of all, I had no idea that IRA disbursements or withdrawals were not counted as income. That's like boom. So a person can get Scree and also have a super healthy retirement account. That makes me think I should save for retirement. But
Right.
anyway, there were some more questions about what is and isn't considered income. So, for example, is there an asset limit that you can have?
Maria, I'm looking at you.
I don't think so, right, Jean? No.
No.
No, they're
Yeah.
looking
So,
at, oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, yeah, interestingly enough, assets aren't considered in screen Drie. It's only if there's any income from those assets. So,
Okay. Uh,
yeah.
Very cool. And then um, you mentioned that like an injury lawsuit payout would not be considered income, but what about like a class action lawsuit payout or jury duty pay? Would those be like count as income?
That is a very good question. I'm going to guess no, but it might be one of those things. This is occasionally what happens where we would say the tenant should try and disclose that information, and the city will let them know. And then I guess the question will be if they're denied, then we decide, or one would have to decide, is that worth trying to challenge and appeal it if we think at that point we think it's wrong. But I would guess it wouldn't count because it sort of seems in the bucket of personal injury settlement monies or, some of the other excluded categories.
Wow. Thank you. Right. So I think those were the ones that yeah. Adriana, were there other questions?
There was one last question that just came through just a few minutes ago. It says, I've been seeing a high volume of notices from Department of Finance stating that they have not received documents from tenants when they are served notices and are quick to end their rent freeze benefits. Even though, as an advocate, we have proof of documents being mailed to Scrie and Drie, this led to file for an appeal, as we know for a fact that we are mailing out the documents that they've requested. What advice can you provide to move the process more smoothly as they are taking a long time to process applications?
Yeah. Yeah. We're also seeing this. It's definitely something that's happening with the Department of Finance. Um, I don't know that there's any trick for making it a smooth process without these issues, but I think just, following up does help and checking in and either calling. If someone applies online, that's a way to sort of have the information right there in your online account, which can be helpful. We know not everyone is going to want to apply online or can easily apply online, but they can call in. And then one thing we sometimes do is that there is an ombuds person. I always mess up that word, for both Scrie and Drie with the Department of Finance, and you can submit an inquiry online. So if someone is having like multiple issues with this and they've called in, they've sent the documents in multiple times, they've called in multiple times and they're not getting anywhere. I think the next step would be submitting an inquiry with an ombuds person to see if they can help navigate what's going on.
Okay. Awesome.
Um,
Well, I think
I,
that is
oh,
no, go ahead, sorry.
sorry. And I took a lot of notes there's just so many details that were new to me, and a lot of the details about household, because families they change, right? Households change, families have ups and downs and ins and outs, and I was wondering if you've seen situations where a family member maybe moves into the apartment and the tenant is kind of confused about, does this person moving in, are they technically now part of the household or are they a roommate? And clearly that makes a huge difference in terms of how income is calculated and whether everybody's going to be able to hang on to this benefit, like the rent freeze that is so very valuable. So, um, I don't know. Like, have you seen some confusion about this, or like, are there general guidelines about whether, like, let's say grandma's adult son is moving back in. Is he household? Is he roommate? Are there guidelines about this?
Well, I'm going to say yes and no. So this kind of a concept, though, like who's in the household, everything you're describing, totally, yes, we hear this a lot and it's very common and totally is a real world reality. But it's interesting, a lot of public benefits, not just Screen discuss household income. So there is sort of guidance, not necessarily just for the Department of Finance and HBD, but like more broadly, these concepts of, well, what does that mean? And I kind of touched on a couple of them. It's like sharing meals, maybe, breaking down the space so that you're sharing things together or you're clearly delineating things. So really what it is, I mean, so we're attorneys, so we're sort of thinking about things through like a legal lens and letting people know, kind of like giving them legal advice and letting things people know. So sometimes when it's sort of a gray area, it kind of is helpful to think, if a person is applying, they're just they should know that what they're telling the city is the truth. And if the city ever hears or figures out something that makes them say, I don't know if that was the truth, they could get in trouble. So you kind of, in a way, are taking a risk, and you just want to be very careful when you're applying to be as clear with yourself and as confident and as comfortable with your own decision. So, like, let's say, I'm working with somebody and they're describing a situation, and I say, and I share these ideas like, are you cooking meals together? Are you grocery shopping? Do you split bills together? Do you make financial decisions together? And these are all things, if the answer is yes, 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 and yes, sounds like a household together. If the answers are sort of no, 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 maybe, then you could kind of say like, well, a person can apply and say what they want to say. They just need to know that if there's ever the city were to like ever figure it out or investigate, oh wow, we actually think this person living with them was part of the family and household, that is a risk. And so you have to really think about, you just don't want to misrepresent anything. So you really want to try to be as honest is possible. And I kind of like give that choice to somebody, like it's up to you. I'm telling you what your legal requirements are and what the risks could be. Um, and it is true, like it could be that somebody's sort of living in an apartment temporarily, they're not necessarily staying, and maybe that's part of like an assessment, and that's something that somebody could say, well, because they were only here for a month, I didn't consider them part of my household, and they weren't contributing, and we weren't buying groceries together, we weren't really doing things together. But it could just be that the city might challenge that. It might say, well, I don't know, it sounds pretty suspicious, So I like to kind of frame it like that. Like that's sort of how you'd want to break it down because this comes up in all kinds of contexts, like regular public assistance, like applying for SNAP, applying for cash assistance. Like this could come up in this context too. And the city is really always, and different agencies are looking at, well, we're going to have our own kind of assessment of all these things to figure out if someone was actually part of a household or were they like fudging it a little. So you kind of just, there isn't like necessarily a bright line rules. It generally speaking is if for parents and children, there's much more of a presumption of a household, or if there's like a legal obligation to take care of someone. Like, so generally speaking, a mom and child, there's just a legal, almost like presumption that they're a family member. Would that be true of like a grandparent and an adult child or something? No, no, family members. Again, the city agencies and we're like, I don't know, it sounds like a family, maybe sounds like a household. But if someone is saying, well, no, here's how it's different. So this is actually very complicated. This is a really tricky question because it does go into some of these gray areas, and it really just is like, in my mind, you're explaining all of this, and someone's just making a call and going to make a choice to say, well, I'll apply, and if the city, they might eventually call me on how I made this assessment, and hopefully I'll be able to explain it and defend it.
Yeah,
I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it
absolutely.
totally does. And I'm just thinking this person might have moved in with grandma because they were hoping to eventually get succession rights as a family member. So,
Right. Yeah. So there you go. And that would be it's something. So that's what we encounter a lot too. If we work with someone with Mitchell Lama and they're part of a remaining family member, they want to seek it someday. Well, then they're definitely part of the household. So then Scrie would need to know. And do the agencies necessarily talk to each other? Maybe not necessarily, but you never want to have contradictory information floating out there, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so very much for doing this training with us today. I just posted the phone number and the email address as well for you guys, for any of you that may have more questions later on down the line. We do have more trainings, I believe, lined up for the rest of our training series through the spring. So for that information, please visit our website. The slides will be posted, like we said, at some point, probably next week. So you guys can always refer back to this. But again, sincerely, thank you guys so much for coming to do this training. This was extremely effective and helpful. So thank you guys so much.
thank you so much for
I
having
hope you
us.
guys, thank you. You guys have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today and enjoy